This program is brought to you by the faithful support of the friends and partners of Rick Renner Ministries.
Welcome to today's program with Rick Renner. Let's join Rick for a message that will inspire, strengthen, and equip you with vital insights and understanding from the Word of God.
Welcome to the program. My name is Rick Renner, and I've been waiting for you, and I'm believing that today you're going to get something brand new you've never heard before from the Word of God. And today we're going to begin in 2 Timothy chapter 1. We're looking at how to survive and thrive in any situation. And for this particular subject, there's no better place to look than the epistle of 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy was written in the year 67, and that is very important because in the year 64, it seems that the Emperor Nero gave the order for one particular section of Rome to be burned down. He wanted to reconstruct that section of Rome, call it Neropolis, name it after himself, and wanted to build there a huge, massive golden palace for himself. That is what happened. And when he began the reconstruction process and began to lavish himself with this luxurious palace, rumors began to hit the streets of Rome that he was the one that caused the blaze that burned down the city of Rome. And when he understood that he probably would be judged and executed, he began to look for a scapegoat on whom he could charge arson. And he decided to choose Christians for a sundry of reasons, which we've already covered in previous programs. If you didn't see the earlier broadcasts on this subject, please go to the archive and watch them, because I believe it will really illuminate the background of the New Testament for you. But from 64 to 67 is when 2 Timothy was written, the church is being hotly pursued, aggressively persecuted because of what took place in the city of Rome. And in all the major cities of the Roman Empire, believers are beginning to feel the heat of that persecution, including the church of Ephesus, which was pastored by Timothy. And Timothy is really dealing with a crisis in his church. People he thought would always be faithful are bailing out. He's experiencing sabotage, defection, people saying, "Pastor, we love you, but if we're faithful, we're probably going to lose our lives, so we're going to hit the road." And Timothy's church, which previously was increasing, is now declining. And not only that, but Timothy is very aware that he is the most visible believer in the city of Ephesus, and because of that, he himself could suffer martyrdom. He is very aware that that is a possibility. And because he is in such a desperate crisis, he has written a letter to the Apostle Paul. And in his letter, we assume that he said, "Paul, help me. I'm in a tough place." The reason we assume that is because 2 Timothy is Paul's response to that letter. So by reading 2 Timothy, Paul is addressing what had been written to him by Timothy. And we know that Timothy has a spirit of fear. How do we know that? Because 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." That word fear is a Greek word which really describes cowardice. This is a fear that makes you want to run for the hills. It's a fear that makes you want to hide or that turns you into a coward. And a spirit of cowardice was trying to attach itself to Timothy so much that in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 8, Paul had to tell Timothy not to be ashamed of the Lord. Listen to what it says in 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 8. It says, "Be not thou therefore ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but be thou partaker of the afflictions of the gospel according to the power of God." At the very first of verse 8, when it says, "Be not thou therefore ashamed," in Greek it is a prohibition, which means Timothy was already tempted to be ashamed. He was already in the process of becoming embarrassed of the testimony of the Lord and of his relationship with Paul. He was concerned about being a friend of Paul because Paul was sitting in Rome in prison, being charged as one of the chief arsonists behind the fire of the year 64. And Timothy knows that if he remains faithful in his relationship to Paul, it might personally cost him his own life. And therefore, he's reevaluating his relationship with Paul. And it seems that he's even reevaluating his relationship with the Lord, because Paul says to him in verse 8, "Don't be ashamed of the Lord." And again, it is a prohibition. You could translate it, "Stop being ashamed of the Lord." That is how much a spirit of fear was beginning to affect him. When a spirit of fear operates in you, you become irrational. You don't think sensibly. You begin to imagine what could happen and what this person would say, and your mind and your imagination begin to take over. And Paul calls it a spirit of fear. But rather than giving us a spirit of fear, Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, God has not given us a spirit of fear or a spirit that turns us into a coward, but of love and of power and of a sound mind. A spirit of fear produces the opposite of those things. Rather than have power, you'll be powerless if you have a spirit of fear. Rather than have love, you'll be loveless if you have a spirit of fear. Rather than have a sound mind, you will not have a sound mind if you have a spirit of fear. Now, how do you deal with a spirit of fear? Well, Paul tells us how to deal with the spirit of fear, and he helps Timothy know how he should deal with his spirit of fear. If you're dealing with any issue that you're afraid of, or if you find that your imagination is running wild and you're beginning to imagine things happening to you that have never happened, but you're afraid that maybe they will happen, an irrational spirit of fear, in 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul offers us very sound advice. And listen to what he says to Timothy, this young preacher who's tempted to be afraid. Listen to what he says beginning in verse 5. When I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and thy mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded that in thee also. He begins talking about Timothy's past. And particularly, he says, I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith. We're going to come back to that word unfeigned in just a moment. The unfeigned faith which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice. The word dwelt is a Greek word which means to take up residency and to fully express itself. In other words, their faith was not just something they doctrinally believed in, but it was a living, real, thriving, flourishing faith. It lived in them, or as the King James Version says, it dwelt in them. This was a real, alive, breathing, flourishing faith. And Paul obviously knew Timothy's family. Well, we know in Acts chapter 16, verse 1, that when Paul first met Timothy, he was living with his mother and his father, and Paul became familiar with Timothy's family. And now Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, God's faithfulness is part of your heritage. The reason you're questioning your future and the reason you're dealing with the spirit of fear is because you're forgetting your past. Let me help you remember. When I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that dwelt, a faith that really lived, a faith that breathed and had full expression, first of all, in your grandmother Lois. I knew your grandmother, and your grandmother had a real faith, and that faith never disappointed her. And your grandmother gave that faith to your mother, Eunice. And your mother had a real faith that dwelt in her. It had full expression. It lived, it breathed, it flourished in her. Your past family had a real experience with faith, and that faith carried them. That faith never disappointed them. And then he says, and now I'm confident this same kind of faith dwells in you. When I read this verse, I always think of my own family. My great-grandmother Miller was a Pentecostal before it was popular to be a Pentecostal. In the 1890s, she was known as a Pentecostal preacher in Indian Territory. And in fact, she was so renowned for her prayers of faith that people that were sick would come to her from all over the territory in order for her to pray for them to be healed. She was a real woman of faith. She had so much faith. She was so brave, so bold, that she actually rode in the Oklahoma land rush and staked a claim in Oklahoma Territory. She was a real woman of faith. She had experiences with angels, the power of God, the preserving power of God. The stories of my grandmother are just amazing. She didn't just have a faith that she believed in, but it was a real, thriving, flourishing faith that affected her entire family. And she passed her faith to her granddaughter. And her granddaughter, my grandmother, had a real, thriving, flourishing faith. It was so real that she passed it on to her daughters, which includes my mother. And my mother grew up in faith. It was her heritage. She got it from her grandmother, from her mother. Now she had it. My mother then passed it on to me, and I have a real, thriving, flourishing faith. It is part of my family heritage, which thankfully now I've passed on to my sons, and my sons walk with God, and now I'm seeing it passed on to our grandchildren, and our grandchildren are walking in the same faith. When I look at God's faithfulness, it is a part of my family heritage. When Timothy looked at his family, God's faithfulness was a part of his family heritage. And when we're tempted to be afraid of the future or because of events we're dealing with in the present, sometimes it's healthy for us to put everything on pause, turn around and look at our past. And remember, God was faithful to me in the past. He was faithful to me and my family. Faith has never failed us. Faith has always worked for us. God has always been true to us. It's part of my family heritage, and the same God who was faithful to my past, the same God who was faithful to my grandmother and my mother or my relatives, that's part of our family heritage. Now that same God is going to be faithful to me. Sometimes you've got to walk through God's faithfulness all the way into your present, and if you do that, you'll encourage yourself in the Lord. Now, maybe you're the first one to believe in your family. If that's the case, then what a privilege you have, because you can begin the faith tradition in your own family. Have a real faith, a breathing faith, a thriving faith, a flourishing faith, a real faith that dwells in you that you can pass on to your children and to your grandchildren. But Paul calls it an unfeigned faith. Listen to these words again in 2 Timothy 1, verse 5, when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith. This word unfeigned is a very interesting Greek word. It's the word an hypokritos. The word an reverses the condition of the second part of the word. The second part of the word is the word hypokritos. Do you hear another word? It's where we get the word in English, hypocrite. The Greek word hypokritos is our word hypocrite. What does this word hypokritos mean? Well, Jesus used this word very famously in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark. One great example is Mark chapter 12, verse 15, when Jesus is speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and he calls them hypocrites. That word hypocrites is the same word, the word hypokritos. Now, where did Jesus get that word hypocrite, and what does the word hypocrite mean? Let me ask you right now, what does the word hypocrite mean to you? Well, let's see where Jesus got this word and what the word hypocrite meant to Jesus. Jesus grew up in the city of Nazareth. But near Nazareth, there was another city by the name of Sepphoris. Sepphoris is where his father Joseph was from. Sepphoris is where Jesus' grandparents lived. And because Nazareth and Sepphoris were very close to each other, Jesus could easily walk from Nazareth to the city of Sepphoris to see his father at work or to visit with his grandparents. And in the city of Sepphoris, there was a theater. And in the theater, there were actors. But the word actor was the word hypokritos, this same word, which in our language is translated hypocrite or hypocrisy. The word hypokritos really was the Greek word which described a stage actor. Actors back in those days changed masks according to their part. If they were playing one role, they would wear a certain mask. If their role changed, then they would put on a different mask. And they played for the approval and the applause of the audience. They would change what they were doing, what they were saying, how they were acting in order to win approval and to win applause. When Jesus used the word hypocrite, that's exactly what he had in mind. So when Jesus said to the scribes and Pharisees, "You are hypocrites," Jesus was literally saying, I know who you guys are. I've seen people like you before on the stage. You change your mask according to who you're talking to. You change the way you act, what you say, what you do. You'll do anything, change anything in order to win the approval or the applause of whoever you happen to be talking to at the moment. Or really, it describes a stage actor. It describes one who wears a mask, or one who deliberately projects an image that is not truthful. One man says it describes someone that is bogus, fake, a pretender, a phony, or it is someone that is insincere. It is one of the most negative words in the New Testament, And this is the word Jesus used to describe the scribes and the Pharisees in Mark chapter 12, verse 15, when he called them hypocrites. So technically, a hypocrite is one that is feigning an image that is not true. He's projecting an image that is not sincere. He is inauthentic. He's phony. He's a scam artist. He is insincere. He's just an actor who's acting the role that is required in order to win the approval or the applause of whoever he's with at the moment. Such a negative word that we're told in Romans chapter 12 and verse 9 that we are to love without hypocrisy, the same word hypokritos, which means don't put on a mask and just pretend to love. Instead, your love should be real. It should be authentic. It should be sincere. In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, it talks about preachers that are hypocrites. And it says they speak lies in hypocrisy. They say one thing, but in fact, that's not who they are. They project one image, but in fact, that image is not really the picture of who they are. They've just donned a mask to project an image to please their audience. They change their style, they change their words, they change their actions for whatever audience is listening to them at the moment. They're insincere, they are inauthentic. That is exactly what the word hypocrite means. But when you come to 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul says, I know that you have an unfeigned faith. It literally means a faith without hypocrisy. In other words, Timothy, there's no acting in your faith. This is not a game. This is real for you. Now, let me say something else about stage actors in the first century. They were considered to be the very lowest part of society because they were insincere. You could never trust a stage actor because you never knew if they were telling you the truth. They were constantly changing what they said. As I said, they were changing what they did, how they acted, what they projected. They could change at the whim of an emotion in order to adapt themselves to whoever they were talking to. And so they were considered to be very inauthentic, very insincere, phony people that you could not trust. So if Timothy had a feigned faith, it would have meant that he had an inauthentic faith. It was not sincere. It was bogus. It was a pretend faith. But when you come to 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 6, Paul says you have an unfeigned faith. Unfeigned has the word "an" attached to the word hypokritos. It describes not a fake faith, but rather it would be translated sincere. You have a sincere faith. Or one expositor says you could translate it a real faith. Perhaps the best translation would be you have an authentic faith. There's nothing fake about your faith. It is absolutely authentic. And Paul says to Timothy, by the way, this didn't begin with you. This began with your grandmother. That real, sincere, authentic faith dwelt in her. It lived in her, breathed in her, flourished in her, and not only in your grandmother, but also in your mother. And then he says in verse 5, and I am persuaded that in thee also. The Greek actually means the same faith is thriving in you as well. It's dwelling in you as well. It is a real faith that lives and breathes and flourishes in your life. Timothy, God was faithful to your family in the past, and that same faith that carried them, that real authentic faith, is the same faith that's working in you right now. And you may be questioning your present and a little fearful of your future, but you're just forgetting your past. Turn around, look at your past, remember all that God has done for your family and for you in the past, and remember it, and it will encourage you in the present. And that's why he continues and says in verse 6, wherefore I put thee in remembrance, that thou might stir up the gift of God which is in thee by the putting on of my hands. When it says, wherefore I put thee in remembrance, the Greek would be literally translated, I am reminding you of all of these things, that by remembering them, you might stir up the gift of God which is in you by the putting on of my hands. I'm reminding you of all of these things, that by remembering them, you might stir up the gift of God which is in thee by the putting on of my hands. Well, stir up the gift of God is a compound of three Greek words, the word ana, which means do it again, the word life, the middle part of the word zao, and the third word is the word pur, the Greek word fire. When you put these three words together, it tells us the fire in Timothy's life was beginning to go out. The embers were beginning to cool down. He was at risk of losing his passion. Why? because he was dealing with a spirit of fear. And a spirit of fear tries to snuff out your fire. It tries to take away your life. And now Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, you need to stir up the embers. You need to stoke the coals. You need to get the gift of God in you flourishing and moving again. Throw off this spirit of fear. How do you throw off a spirit of fear? How do you rekindle the flame in your heart? How do you stir up the gift of God in your life? And Paul tells us emphatically in this verse. He says, wherefore I put thee in remembrance that thou might stir up the gift of God, or as we've already seen, I'm reminding you of all of these things, that by your remembering them, you might stir up the gift of God, which is in you by the putting on of my hands. Now, if I said to you, you stir up the gift of God by memorizing the Bible, you might say, oh, I have trouble memorizing the Bible. Or if I said you stir up the gift of God in you by asking somebody to lay hands on you, you might say, well, what do I do when there's no one around to lay hands on me? And that would be legitimate. You can make all kinds of excuses for things you can't do to stir up the gift of God. So Paul tells us something we can all do. He says, remember. I'm reminding you of all these things. I'm reminding you of what things? I'm reminding you about the faith that lived in your grandmother. I'm reminding you about the faith that lived in your mother. I'm reminding you that God has been faithful to your family. It's part of your family heritage. Timothy, stop, turn around, look at your past, walk through all of God's faithfulness and all the years leading up to your present. Remember that God has healed you. God has delivered you. God has saved you. God has provided for you. Remember all the acts of God to deliver, to save, to preserve you, all in your past. Walk yourself through your past all the way up to your present. I'm reminding you of all of these wonderful things, that by remembering them, you might rekindle the flame that is in your heart. I know from my own personal experience that when a spirit of fear has tried to deal with me, I stop, put everything on pause, I turn around and look at my past. For example, when we were in a big building project in the city of Moscow, and we needed millions of dollars to complete that project, I had moments when a spirit of fear would try to come on me. And naturally, if all I did was look at my present, it looked pretty fearful. It looked scary because we needed a lot of cash. We needed it very quickly, didn't know where it was going to come from, and we had to have it now. Naturally speaking, I could have experienced a spirit of fear. That when a spirit of fear would attempt to wrap its tentacles around me, I would throw it off. How would I throw it off? By putting everything on pause and reflecting on everything God's already done for me in my past. The last time I was in a building program and I didn't have the cash to build. The last time we needed money very quickly. I didn't know where it was going to come from, but God supernaturally provided. I began walking myself through every moment when God supernaturally provided. Or if I've been in a situation that seemed physically dangerous, rather than focus on the danger in front of me, I put everything on pause and remember all the times in my past when I was also in physically dangerous situations, that the power of God lovingly preserved me and protected me. I walked through every one of those experiences, walking from the past all the way up into the present. And by the time I get to my present, what I'm looking at now really does not look so big. The need for cash really does not look so big. It's no worse than anything I've already faced in life, and God has been faithful every single time that I faced something difficult. By remembering, you stir up the gift of God that is in you. Remembering is powerful. I can remember, you can remember. This is something that we can all do. Now, interesting, the word remember is the Greek word menea, and the word menea is really the Greek word for a grave. And to remember, you may have to unearth some old memories. You may have to deliberately put the present on pause and go back and begin to unearth some of those old memories. Maybe they become cluttered, they become buried because of present troubles and present fears. You've got to go back to the past. You've got to remember. To remember, first of all, you've got to unearth, you've got to remove the clutter, and you've got to decide, I am going to remember the faithfulness of God. This is why in the Old Testament, the children of Israel were often told to remember the works of the Lord. Why? Because when you remember everything that God has done in the past, it makes your present problems look so much smaller. If God could do that then certainly God can do this now. And by remembering, we stir up the gift of God that is in us. And that's exactly what verse 6 says. Listen to it again. Wherefore I put thee in remembrance, that thou stir up the gift of God which is in thee by the putting on of my hands, or in summation, I'm reminding you of all these things. I'm reminding you of God's past faithfulness in your life in order that you would remember them, and by remembering them, you would stir up the gift of God that is in you. Then he wraps it up in verse 7 when he says, for God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. God's plan is not for you to be gripped with fear. God's plan is for you to be free of fear, to be energized by your real, authentic faith, and for you to operate in power and in love and in a sound mind. And we're out of time. I can't believe this program's already over, but it's been such a pleasure to be with you. And as I close, I want to tell you that if you need prayer, we're here for you, and we would love to pray for you. Use the information that is on the screen. Let us know how to pray, and I assure you that our team and Denise and I will go to prayer on your behalf. But in closing, remember Ecclesiastes 8:4. It says, where the word of a king is, there's power. Let the word of God release its power in your life today. And I'll see you in the next program.
Spiritual warfare confronts all of us, whether we realize it or not. In his newly updated and instructive book, Life in the Combat Zone, Bible teacher Rick Renner clearly outlines the mental and spiritual toughness every believer must develop in order to endure hardness as a good soldier. The wisdom and understanding offered in this book will help prepare you for battle, encourage you in the midst of conflict, and establish you long after your victory has been won. Order your copy today. In his CD message, Overcoming a Spirit of Fear, Rick Renner explains why fear is the #1 tool the enemy uses to sabotage your life potential. You will discover how to overcome the paralyzing torment that fear produces so you can move forward and cross over into a fear-free life. This inspiring message is our special gift to you this month. Visit our website at renner.org to download this free audio message along with a PDF of corresponding study notes to help you dig deeper into the Word of God.
Dear friends and partners, my name is Joel Renner, and right now I'm in our church bookstore here in Moscow, Russia. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to tell you about books. We have been distributing books like these, My Father's Teaching out of the Bible, for years. Thousands and thousands of people have received these books, more books, biblical teaching, and their lives have been changed. And I just wanted to let you know about it, because it's through your giving that we can print these books and send them to people and hear the stories of people's lives being changed. And I wanted to say thank you for supporting our ministry and being with us.
Thank you for watching this broadcast. Rick looks forward to being with you again next week. For more information on product resources or to learn how you can partner with this ministry, please connect with us at renner.org or call 1-800-742-5593. Also, please be sure to visit us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.